This is Holyrood Sources. Thank you very much for listening. Thanks for being with us this week. Let's welcome to the podcast External Affairs Secretary for the Scottish Government, Angus Robertson. Angus, hello. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Calum. Hi, Andy. How are you both?
Yeah, good. Thank you. It's good to see you. I suppose more to the point, how are you doing? It's been a bit of a busy old week for you.
It's been busy. I've been reflecting on it, though, given the subject matter, which I'm sure most listeners will be aware, which revolves around what's happening in Gaza and relations with Israel. Just been kind of reflecting on what life is actually like for people there, for people living in Gaza, which is absolutely horrific for people in Israel, many who have relatives who are still hostages. And of course, not forgetting the fact that we have at least one family that I'm aware of in Scotland who are grieving a brother and a relation who was murdered by Hamas. So I think everything needs to be put in its context. It's been a challenge, no doubt. You'll want to ask about the Scottish Government's relations with Israel, and for that matter with the Palestinians as well, and the issue of the tragedy that's unfolding in Gaza. And there are many tragedies happening in the West Bank as well, which we shouldn't lose sight of. But I'm reminding myself a lot about the challenges that people are facing there. It's just a totally different order of things, and I think that's a way of putting things in perspective.
Yeah. On that note, then, how would you describe the Scottish Government's relations, first of all, with Israel? As a result of all that has happened and the controversies of the week, what words would you use to describe the relationship now?
Well, I was going to start with a bit of history, but in terms of now, I think firstly, the Scottish Government has said what needed to happen. From our perspective, from the perspective of colleagues right across the Scottish Parliament, because I think it's important to remember this issue was debated and voted on in the Parliament, where there's very, very strong support for a ceasefire, for the humanitarian access to people in Gaza, for the release of the hostages. And there are very, very strong and understandable feelings about the disproportionate use of force that Israel has been meting out on Gaza, and the overwhelming majority of tens of thousands of victims who have died, and that's not counting those who've been injured, are civilians. And so people feel very strongly about that. And the Israeli embassy and the Israeli government, if they didn't know about the views of the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament, they did after the meeting that I had. I think they're probably used to hearing that internationally, because that's the position of most countries in the European Union, most countries around the world that are calling for a ceasefire, for an end to the disproportionate use of force and the killing and maiming of people in Gaza. And so there will not be any further ministerial meetings with the Israelis until that situation fundamentally changes. I mean, I think it's fair to say that the relationship historically has also not been easy, because this is, horrific though it is, this is only the latest chapter in the tragedy of the occupation for Palestinians and terrorist acts that Israelis have to live with at home and abroad, and the hopelessness for many who hope for a solution because it's so intractable. And I mean, as somebody who's been in and around external affairs matters, international affairs, both professionally, for those who don't know, I was a diplomatic affairs correspondent before I was elected, and I've been very closely involved with many intractable areas, because I've always had a hope that Scotland might be able to offer something, not the answer to things, but perhaps a place where solutions might be found to these problems. I've been keen for us to engage, so I led the first ever senior SNP delegation to Palestine and Israel, where we met with the then Palestinian Prime Minister in Ramallah, toured the West Bank. We're able to see the extreme situations in which the Palestinians live, the duress, the disempowerment, how the occupation works. saw an Israeli military court in action, if you want to call it that, which was a disgrace. And at the same time was very careful to make sure that we were, whilst talking to the Palestinians, always also talking to the Israelis as well. So in Israel, I was the first senior SNP parliamentarian to mark respects at Yad Vashem, to remember Jane Haining, the Scottish victim in the Holocaust, and go to the memorial to Willie McRae, a former vice president of the Scottish National Party, who was one of the main authors of Israel's Law of the Sea. So there is a connection between Scotland and Israel and Palestine, because there are Scottish Jews and Scottish Israelis, and there are Scottish Palestinians, and there are wider communities of very strong connection with the issues there. So I've been involved in it for quite a long time and aware of the risks of that, and latest developments are a reminder that it is a very challenging area to navigate.
Yeah, indeed. It's interesting, all of that, because clearly there is a long-standing belief that there is a role for the Scottish Government to play with Israel, with Palestine, and to have something of a relationship there. And so with that as a kind of foundational principle, I suppose, is there not an argument that from the outside, the events of this week, after your meeting with the Deputy Ambassador, Israel's Deputy Ambassador to the UK, from the outside it could be perceived that the fact there is no further ministerial meetings to happen, that the Scottish Government has caved to something of a vociferous, angry, largely online mob here, that we've strayed from the principle of we should have a relationship?
Well, we have a relationship, we've had a relationship, and I think everybody who believes in diplomacy will hope that there are circumstances where the situation improves for people in Gaza and the West Bank. And one has to hope, and it'll only happen through diplomacy, that there will be a two-state solution to what happens in that part of the world. It's not without precedent that circumstances have been so difficult that it's led to a pause in ministerial relations. It's happened previously with Israel and the Scottish Government, and it's happened previously with Russia and the Scottish Government, and it's happened for many other governments as well. And these are the things that one has to navigate. I think understanding that there had not been a face-to-face meeting with them to outline the Scottish Government's position on Gaza and the strongly held views that there are by the Scottish Government, the Scottish Parliament, and I think most people in Scotland too, I think that is what diplomacy is there for, to communicate that effectively. I think where a difficulty has come from many people, and that's not just an internal SNP issue, that's for everybody who is particularly informed and concerned and horrified by what's going on in Gaza in particular, is a sense that this was a sort of a run-of-the-mill meeting, or that it reflected a normalization of relations with the Israeli government. And that is an impression that, well, firstly, was not right, but people's impressions really count. And for that, I've apologized, because I think people are right to expect that their government should conduct their relations with people elsewhere in keeping with the strongly held feelings that there are, in particular, on this issue. I mean, this is the touchstone issue of our time at the present time. People are protesting outside the Democratic National Convention in the United States at the moment. There are prominent Labour politicians who lost their seat in England in the recent UK general election because of this issue, all of which reflects the fact that there are a lot of people who feel very strongly about that, and they're not wrong to feel that strongly about it. And that's why the challenge of navigating this issue in particular is a challenge. Having said that, I think it's right that the message has been delivered, the message has been heard, and I think it's right for the Scottish Government to continue to share the views of members of the Scottish Parliament and Scotland more generally about the issue, and to try and do it in the most appropriate way.
Yeah, it's all really. I mean, I think that Angus's reflections are really interesting. I thought that been struck listening to that, just how balanced Angus's comments are, and of course, that's what international diplomacy is. It's a balance. It's always a balance. I think the interesting thing for me, people always focus on what's happening in the moment. Memories tend to be short, and right now, there is a significant global problem with the behaviour of the Israeli government and the way they are prosecuting this war against Hamas. You only have to go back to October, of course, when the outrage was quite properly and clearly on Hamas and not on the Israeli government. But as I say, we deal with, we tend as a country to deal with what's in front of us right now. Being in government is complicated, and being in government is difficult, and that's fine. It should be difficult to be in government. That's why we pay our politicians, and that's why we have them govern. But I think that it's been a disappointing week for me, and I'm slightly worried about the precedent. I understand why everything that's happened this week in terms of the reaction has happened, but if Scotland is going to have a global role, and we'll maybe get onto that in a second, outside of this particular issue of this week and outside of this conflict in terms of Angus's actual more general role. But if Scotland is going to have a global role and be involved in discussions at this level, you can't pick and choose. You have to be able to have discussions across the board. And if you are going to be involved in the world's most intractable conflict, you have to speak to both sides. You can't just speak to one. Angus has outlined that he has had many relations in the past with Israel and with the Palestinians, and that's fine. And I hope that what comes of this week is not now an inability in future to meet the Israelis, because we cannot solve this problem without the Israelis. And let's remember, outside of Bibi Netanyahu and outside of the last few months of just extreme difficulty with their behaviour, Israel is an ally. It is one of the few democratic countries in the region, and it isn't going anywhere. So we have to talk to them. And that's my big worry about this week, is that it will now not be difficult at all for the Scottish Government to meet a Palestinian delegation. That's fine. That can happen. That could happen tomorrow, and there wouldn't be any fallout about it. I hope it's not difficult to meet an Israeli delegation now in the future because of this.
Well, the first thing I would reflect on is this is not the only issue, and I'm not minimising this in any way, but it is not the only bilateral relationship which has significant challenges because of human rights dimensions, primarily. So, when I went to China, I was being impressed on by people who are very concerned about human rights in China, about outlining the position of the Scottish Government, whilst at the same time having to balance that, for example, with the fact that we now have a very significant cohort of Chinese students studying in Scotland. We have very significant economic interests. And how does one balance these things? The last First Minister met the President of Turkey. That was something that caused upset to people for whom the plight of the Kurdish population in Turkey is a major priority. Human rights issues in Africa, including Scotland's partner countries, are also a consideration. I could go on, but we are not alone in the world in having to navigate these difficulties and these challenges. And I think at the heart of it, the recognition that talking is important, laying out one's position is important, whilst at the same time being able to have that relationship and those conversations, I think is really important. And it's really important for all countries that aspire to having international relations, and particularly for those of us who believe that Scotland should be an independent sovereign state. And one of my main motivating factors for wishing Scotland to be independent is so that we can, in Winnie Ewing's famous words, stop the world Scotland wants to get on. Because I think we have things to offer. It's not that we're going to solve intractable problems, but sometimes being a place means that you have something to offer. And I reflect on the first peace talks between parliamentarians from Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and the South Caucasus. It took place in Scotland. I hosted those talks. Did it solve the problems of the South Caucasus? No, it didn't. Might it be a mere footnote in the history of that part of the world? No doubt it will. But I tell you something, having got to know the very brave participants of that meeting, and they had to meet one another, Armenians and Azeris and Georgians, where this is potentially threatening to their lives to be speaking to the other side. You realize that the stakes are really, really high, as in diplomacy, the stakes are really, really high for the participants as well as the countries that they come from. And that's an area where I think Scotland does have something to offer. People know Scotland, people like Scotland, people want to come to Scotland. And that in itself is a reason why, if you think back, those talks took place, talks in relation to peace in Northern Ireland took place in Scotland. And if there's an opportunity for Scotland to do such a thing in the future, I would welcome that, because we are known and Scotland is liked around the world. So I think we need to recognise we do have something to offer, but that will always be a challenge as to how one navigates it. I mean, part of the other thing that I would reflect on is that Scotland is a relatively small country. And I say that in relation to our own debate around issues. And we're very familiar with one another. We know one another. And that's why when an issue comes along, and social media plays a role, of course, in amplifying all of this, you suddenly have a very active debate about a challenging issue, as we've had in the last week and a bit about relations with Israel. I don't think that's going to change. That is not a problem of itself, but how we navigate that so that we are able to speak to people, we are able to reflect our values, and where we come to a point where we have to say to some other countries, we can't go on pretending that this is normal, because it's not normal, and that's where we've got to with Israel.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think it's interesting actually to look at this in the wider context as well. I was thinking about this earlier, Calum. You and I sat with Geoff and Angus's colleague Ivan McKee and Liam MacArthur and Daniel Johnson last week in Kirkwall, doing the Islands Tour podcast. We sat in a distillery which hosted us, and our podcast was sponsored by a salmon farmer and a renewable energy company. Mm-hmm. Whiskey, salmon, energy, Scotland's three biggest exports. The latter, through green hydrogen, possibly being the backbone of the Scottish economy for decades, centuries maybe to come, who knows. Mm-hmm. With the best will in the world, and I say this as somebody who is not a nationalist, with the best will in the world, the UK can always sell your stuff for you. You know, we're 10%, right? They've got other things to do as well. They've got other nations to represent. Sometimes Scotland has to represent itself, even as a sub-state actor, not as an independent actor, but even as a sub-state actor. Sometimes Scotland has to represent itself. And the soft, not just the obvious exports that I mentioned, but also the soft power of Scotland as well. Tartan Week, there are lots of things that Scotland needs to do to make Scotland better, whether in a devolved setting or an independent setting. And for that reason, I've actually always supported the existence of Angus's role. Not everybody has, it's fair to say. Not everybody from the unionist community has. But I think it's an important role, because I think Scotland needs representation on the world stage. And, again, my hope from the fallout of the last week or so is that this doesn't diminish from the fact that Scotland needs this role, not just for conflict resolution, which is not, I'm sure Angus would say himself, is not a big part of the role, right? The role is actually about taking Scotland PLC to the world. And I think that is important. And again, I hope that we don't lose that because of this fallout of the last week or so.
So let's take hydrogen, because that's a really good case in point, and it's of all the things that is I spend a lot of my time thinking and doing and representing Scotland around, it is probably, I think it's probably one of the most important things that there is going at the moment. And why is that? So, and I have to say, and I'm pleased to be in a format where one can talk more discursively about this. I am still, what's the right way of putting it? Let me put it this way. I find it remarkable that we are going through a total energy revolution on our continent. And we are not having a debate around that in one of the most energy-rich countries in Europe. So Scotland has won twice on the natural resource lottery. Oil and gas, obviously, in the 60s, emerging in the 70s. And for anybody who's vaguely informed about what is happening around energy in Scotland should understand the scale of Scotland's renewable energy potential. And if one understands the scale of the renewable electricity potential, one understands how much hydrogen can be produced. At the same time, the biggest economy in Europe, Germany, is changing the entire foundation of its industrial base to be fueled by hydrogen. And when you join these two things together, one surely realizes that if we have a lot of hydrogen and Germany needs a lot of hydrogen, this is really, really important. And so what I've been spending a lot of time doing is two things. One, helping the likes of the Germans, but others, the Dutch, the Belgians and others, realize that Scotland offers potentially an answer to their challenge in not being able to produce hydrogen at scale. So we can help fuel their economy. And the other bit of the equation is helping our northern neighbours, the Irish, the Icelanders, the Norwegians, the Faroese, the Danes, and others realise, because we're all windy northern countries, that we are all unbelievably renewable energy rich in our potential, and we're trying to reach that potential. This is something that's coming. We know it's coming. So to marry together an understanding of the opportunity and the challenge so that we are at the front of the queue as our economies fundamentally change, as our energy markets change. And yes, how we get that just transition, in particular for the northeast of Scotland, working right, how we get all that is probably the biggest single thing that I am trying to make changes with in relation to our external affairs. And to Andy's point about the extent to which the UK represents Scotland's interests in this, I've attended international conferences where energy had been talked about and listened to UK ministers not mention Scotland once, not mention Scotland's energy potential once, and not mention hydrogen. So there's not an imagining of there's a requirement to do this. We must do this, because if we don't, we will miss the boat. And we can't miss the boat. We need Scotland to be absolutely front and centre of this energy transition, not just because others require it, but if we have the aspiration to be a genuine leader in renewables technology, in the economic benefits and environmental benefits it will bring for us, it also recasts Scotland's relationship with our northern European neighbours. And in Scotland, I think over centuries, we kind of forgotten our links with our northern neighbours because it was very important 1,000 years ago. It was less important during the time of the British Empire, where further horizons meant that we didn't look north, west or east in quite the same way. But now, with what's going on energy, we could get onto the strategic or the defence dimensions to it, which are equally important. Our northern relations really matter. So to Andy's point, external affairs really matter, because much of this, at the heart of it, is devolved. But even getting into the territory of where there is controversy, or has been with the last government, I have to say I haven't had any of that played back to me by the incoming UK government, for which I think we can all be grateful. I think we do need to understand that external affairs is about much more than meetings and ministers travelling places or delegations coming here. It's about delivering progress for the economy, in education, in culture, and. And if Scotland is one thing, as we should know, it is an international nation of emigration and immigration, with links right around the world and a massive diaspora. And for the first time, I think we're trying to understand that, embrace that, and make the most that we can of that. And that's another part of what I'm spending a lot of time doing. But I think all of these things do matter. They're very relevant, and we have to get right. And just to finish off, I think there is a change. I think I have noticed a change in the Scottish Parliament in relation to how other political parties view external affairs. My former opposite number, who's no longer in the Scottish Parliament, Donald Cameron, I think started asking some really important questions about the Scottish Government's network of international offices. Not from the sense of criticising the fact that we are there trying to promote and sell and all of that internationally, but why is there not a Scottish Government in South America or in Southeast Asia? Outside China. So there's an appreciation that there is a requirement to reach out to the world for different reasons, and we should do it as well as we can. And I work quite hard to help my colleagues in other parties appreciate why this is important, and we also shouldn't lose sight of the fact that Scotland's government network was first initiated under the Conservatives and was expanded under Labour and the Liberal Democrats in government. So there should be cross-party understanding why all of this matters, and I think it matters more than it ever has, and I think we need to do it as well as we can.
Interesting. It's a very, very collegiate approach there, Angus, to give credit where it's due, over the past number of years, which I think is notable in this context as well.
Well, I mean, usually foreign relations, or in our context, external affairs, are traditionally not matters of inter-party or significant inter-party difference. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
So take another example of that. We've got an incoming UK Labour government. And I hear them now talking about Brand Scotland, something the last UK government didn't do. And of course, we already have a Brand Scotland partnership, which is amazing. It is a matter of real interest from other countries who haven't managed to deliver such a thing. Those who aren't aware of it, listeners and viewers to this podcast, we bring together our tourism agency, we bring together our economic development agency that's also responsible for inward investment, our universities, Food and Drink Scotland, and we promote Scotland around the world through Brand Scotland, an initiative that I chair on behalf of the Scottish Government. And if people are going to row in behind and support that, well, firstly, that'll be a change, because the last UK government didn't. But if people are going to recognise that there are good things that happen to promote Scotland and they want to support it, great. And I think if I can contribute in any way to helping people realise that this is not and shouldn't be seen as part of constitutional difference, of course, if I'm asked about what is the position of the Scottish Government, of course I tell them I wish the position of the Scottish Government and the majority in the Scottish Parliament is for an independent Scotland. But most of the meetings that I have, the focus for the Scottish Government is entirely around our economic relations, our educational promotion, inward investment, supporting our links in the diaspora. I'll give you a really good example of that. Only this week I met the Argentinian ambassador, and we were exploring the fact that, here's a confession, I didn't know this to be the case. Argentina has the 5th biggest Scottish diaspora in the world.
Oh.
It's remarkable. And they have a national footballer in their national team called McAllister, which is a reflection of that. But what are we doing with that? How are we making the most of that? And that is but one example of where we have links. Let's build on them and let's seek out the advantage. And surely everybody can see that as a good thing.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful to get an understanding on what the role is, on what external affairs means. And I'll be interested in our listeners' responses to that. Of course, you can email hello@holyroodsources.com. Just a final question, Angus. You've been very generous with your time, and we've just got a couple of minutes left. I want to ask you, we've been talking a lot about sort of diplomatic efforts. How big a diplomatic effort is the SNP conference going to be for you next week? I mean, I've been gathering a list of SNP MSPs who've been critical of you in the last few days, you personally, and the approach of the government in terms of this meeting with Israel, the Israeli deputy ambassador. I just wonder if it's going to be a conference that exposes factions, difficulties that need some sort of outreach on your behalf.
Well, I've always done my best to try and get on with everybody in the party. I've been in it for a long time, so I know our parliamentarians and I know our membership quite well. And I understand the reasons why people would be significantly unhappy about a sense that there's a normalization of relations with Israel in the circumstances that we've discussed at some length. I have to say, since I've been pointing that out, in recent days, I've had very, very positive feedback from colleagues, not least from the former First Minister and Hamza Yusuf, who's very, very close to this as an issue, and whose advice and support in all of this has been very important to me, and I think that will be recognised by party members. So I look forward to SNP conferences as I do every year. They're not what they were. When I first joined the SNP, we would sort of meet in smaller venues in certain smaller locations in Scotland, and now we still have to meet in the really big venues, and that's why I like conference, because there's a lot of newer members, and I enjoy speaking with them. So as in every year, I look forward to SNP conference.
Nice.
I think the interesting thing about SNP conference as well is that it would be. I hope it moves on from beyond this, and I think it will. I don't think it'll be dominated by this, to be honest with you. The interesting thing for those of us who observe Scottish politics at SNP conference is it's the first chance that the SNP have to let the population know whether they really get it and whether they understand what happened to them at last month's election. I don't think we've seen a huge amount of change so far from the Scottish Government, to be honest. I don't think we've seen a huge amount of reflection. We talked about this earlier in the podcast with Lucy and Kat. I don't think there's been a huge amount of change, and I'll be really interested to see the mood music, what John Swinney has to say, what Kate Forbes has to say. Are we going to see a party which gets it, or are we going to see a party that doesn't understand why it just lost?
Interesting.
Well, no doubt you'll be discussing that at some length in the podcast, and having been on this week, I suspect I won't be part of the panel that discusses it the next time around. But as you know, I'm a fan of the podcast, so I will look forward to watching that with great interest.
Well, we look forward to seeing you there, Angus, and we're very grateful for you taking the time to join us on the podcast today. So thank you very much. Thanks for that.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for watching. Press subscribe and you'll get all the best videos offering insight on Scottish politics delivered straight to your feed. Press subscribe and stick around. And if you'd like to hear our conversations in full, open up your podcast app and search for Holyrood Sources.